A single glove, soaked in lake water, scented faintly with gunpowder and whispering of a secret never meant to be found. Behind it lies a mystery of vanished truths, a death in the shadows, and a silence stitched tighter than any alibi. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a sullen morning in early October that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in the familiar sitting room of our Baker Street lodgings. Outside, the rain fell in a persistent, slanting drizzle that blurred the panes and left the streets below cloaked in a veil of silver melancholy. A fire crackled modestly in the grate, its glow playing across the cluttered table and illuminating the glint of Holmes's long, slender fingers as they steepled beneath his chin. He had not spoken in over an hour. I had abandoned my newspaper some time ago, preferring instead to observe the stillness of his pose, eyes half-lidded, brow gently furrowed, as though weighing some private calculus beyond my reach. There was a kind of reverence in that silence, as though Holmes communed with thought itself. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured at last, without shifting his gaze from the fire. "How often the greatest disturbances begin with the lightest of touches." I leaned forward. "You have something?" He gave no reply, merely rising to his feet as the doorbell rang below, and the first ripple of that day's mystery touched the edge of our world. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later bearing a small brown-wrapped parcel which she handed to Holmes with her customary nod of polite curiosity. "Delivered by a young lad, sir. No return address." Holmes accepted it with a flicker of interest, carried it to the table, and began to unwrap it with a care that suggested more than casual intrigue. Within was a single item, a woman's glove, slim, cream-coloured, and delicately stitched in the French style. He held it between his fingers as a jeweller might a fine gem. "Well made, worn frequently, but not carelessly," he murmured. I rose from my chair and stepped closer. "A token of some sort? A message?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned the glove over slowly, noting the faint yellowing near the base of the fingers, the slightly misshapen thumb, the barest hint of frayed thread at the wrist seam. Then he raised it to his nose and inhaled lightly. "Interesting," he said at length. "This is not merely a glove, Watson. It is a letter written in leather and powder." "A letter? Of the most desperate kind," he replied, his tone growing cool. "One that requires no ink to convey terror." Holmes set the glove on the table with a gentleness that belied the tension I now saw sharpening the lines around his mouth. "Note, Watson," he began, "the stitching along the inside of the cuff, hand-sewn, but repaired with hurried threadwork. This woman is accustomed to refinement, yet has recently had no access to her usual services. Further, the fraying suggests it was pulled off hastily, perhaps in fear, perhaps in flight." He turned it slightly, allowing the lamplight to catch the surface. "There is a faint sheen near the outer knuckles, residue of talcum, but not the floral variety common among the London ladies. No, this is mixed with a finer dust, gunpowder, or something near to it." I blinked. "A lady handling a firearm? Or kept near one? Possibly in proximity to an armoury, a concealed weapon, or another's possession of such." He lifted the glove again, brought it to his nose once more, and said, "And here, the most telling detail, a whisper of brackish damp, not river water, not the Thames. This scent is fresh, alpine, perhaps a lake fed by snowmelt. Surely not something one might detect from—" Holmes silenced me with a glance. "There is also the faintest undertone of lavender oil, used to mask some greater anxiety." "Then she fled?" "Not fled, Watson. Escaped. And not from London merely, but from a presence far more insidious." The glove lay between us like an accusation. Holmes, suddenly grave, turned to the window. She left in fear, and where fear seeks refuge, the mountains often call. Holmes walked to the window and gazed through the rain-slicked glass, his silhouette drawn in stark relief against the leaden sky. He spoke without turning. "She has gone to Geneva." I stared at him, half suspecting a jest, but found none. "Geneva? Holmes, you astound me. How can you be certain?" He stepped away from the window and gestured lightly toward the glove. "The scent of lake water, specifically alpine. There are but few European cities where such a climate meets high society. Geneva is one. The lavender oil is of a particular grade, common in perfumeries near Mont Blanc, but not exported. And lastly, the thread used to mend the seam. It's of Swiss linen, not English." I said nothing. He continued. "A woman in danger, with the means to flee, but no desire to be traced. She chose a place where politics, discretion, and diplomacy converge. Geneva offers anonymity within civility. It offers shelter, but not safety." He returned the glove to its wrapping and placed it gently back upon the table. "What remains unknown, Watson, is the nature of the threat she fled. That, I suspect, will not remain hidden long." A silence fell between us. Then Holmes looked up, his eyes alive with purpose. "Pack your bag, old friend. We leave on the morning train." The following morning broke no clearer than the last, with a leaden sky above and a heaviness in the air that seemed to press against the windows of Baker Street. It was some time after breakfast when a carriage drew to a sudden halt outside, followed shortly by the hurried tread of polished boots ascending our stair. The man who entered was tall, fashionably dressed in a dark frock coat and gloves, though his countenance betrayed a restlessness at odds with his refinement. A fine moustache trembled above tight lips, and his eyes, though grey and intelligent, darted as if seeking some invisible threat. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," he said. "I am Sir Reginald Marchand of the Foreign Office." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Sir Reginald, you are welcome. May I offer you a seat?" The diplomat remained standing a moment longer, glancing toward me, before lowering himself stiffly into the chair by the hearth. "I apologize for the sudden intrusion, Mr. Holmes," he continued. "But I have come on a matter of the gravest delicacy and of personal distress." Holmes studied him with narrowed eyes. "Then pray begin, Sir Reginald. The urgency with which you arrived speaks of something more than protocol." Sir Reginald removed his gloves with mechanical precision and leaned forward, speaking in a low, strained voice. "It concerns my wife, Isadora. She disappeared from our residence in Belgravia 2 nights ago. There was no quarrel, no disturbance, only silence. Her maid found her bed unslept in, her belongings undisturbed, save for a missing travelling cloak and one small valise. No note, no explanation." He paused, visibly agitated. "This morning I received no word from her. Instead, this arrived." He reached into his coat and withdrew a familiar parcel, the same in which the glove had arrived the day prior. Holmes opened it once more, the glove now resting in his palm like a relic. He examined it briefly, then nodded. "It was not you who sent it, then?" "No," said Sir Reginald, perplexed. "It appeared on my doorstep. No signature. Nothing." Holmes's fingers drummed once against his knee. "And this was the only indication she left behind?" "The only one," Marchand affirmed, his voice brittle. "Isadora is not an impulsive woman. Her disappearance is entirely out of character." "Then we must consider that it was not impulsivity that drove her," Holmes said quietly, "but necessity." At that, a flicker of discomfort passed over Sir Reginald's face. "Was there anyone who might have influenced her movements?" Holmes asked, still gazing at the glove. Sir Reginald hesitated. "There was one report, unconfirmed." My footman Harrows saw her the afternoon before she vanished, walking alone in Hyde Park near the Serpentine. He said she was speaking to a gentleman he did not recognize. What manner of gentleman? Pale, said Marchand after a pause, and dressed with a certain foreign flair. A long coat, high collar. He had a limp, Harrows believes, though he could not say if it was feigned. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Was he known to you? Number nor, to my knowledge. To her. Holmes glanced at me, then back to our visitor. Yet she chose to walk with him publicly. That suggests familiarity, or perhaps desperation. Did Harrows observe how they parted? He said they were walking slowly. She appeared agitated. He did not stay long enough to see their departure. Holmes nodded absently, his gaze distant. It is often in such half-glimpsed moments that truth crouches, Sir Reginald, he said, and I suspect this pale gentleman may cast a longer shadow than you yet know. Marchand offered no reply, but his mouth had tightened into a hard, unreadable line. For a moment the room fell silent, save for the soft crackle of the fire. Then Holmes asked, with deceptive casualness, "You mentioned your wife's disappearance is out of character. Might there be any political entanglements that render her vulnerable?" Sir Reginald looked away. "There are certain complexities," he admitted. "My wife is of Franco-Swiss birth. Her father was a minor functionary in the Geneva consulate. Since our marriage, she has maintained her dual citizenship." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And thus, diplomatic immunity while abroad?" "Precisely. In Switzerland, she cannot be legally compelled to testify or even detained, unless she consents." Holmes gave a low hum. "Most inconvenient, particularly if she has reason to fear extradition, or believes herself to be pursued by agents of a foreign power." Marchand's face reddened. "I do not suggest she is guilty of anything. But yes, her legal protections complicate matters. Were she in England, we might proceed with inquiries. In Geneva—" Holmes completed the sentence softly. "You are bound by silence." He rose then, slowly, as though coming to some internal resolution. "The law may be constrained, Sir Reginald, but truth is often less so." I watched the diplomat's face and thought I glimpsed, if only briefly, the shadow of guilt beneath his polished veneer. Holmes walked to the window and stood there a moment, silent, his figure outlined by the diffused light of the grey morning. Then, turning back, he said, "I will take your case, Sir Reginald." The diplomat exhaled visibly, relief flashing across his features. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I had hoped—" "But understand this," Holmes interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You have withheld something, perhaps more than one thing. I do not ask you to speak now, for I believe you will be more candid when the facts themselves begin to corner you." Sir Reginald looked as though he might object, but Holmes raised a hand. "I require no reassurances, only access to her correspondences, her staff, and her last known movements. We shall begin at once." He moved past Marchand and retrieved his coat from the stand. "Watson, you may wish to have your bag ready by nightfall." I nodded, accustomed by now to such abrupt mobilizations. Sir Reginald rose. "If there is anything I can do—" "There is," Holmes replied without warmth. "Pray do not attempt to control the direction of this inquiry. You have already done so enough." With that, the matter was no longer an invitation, but a pursuit, and the chase had begun. The home of Sir Reginald and Lady Isadora Marchand stood in a hushed crescent of Belgravia, its polished stone facade offering no hint of the turbulence concealed within. We arrived there under grey skies and were admitted by a housemaid whose expression was taut with suppressed anxiety. The drawing room into which we were shown bore the scent of lavender and coal smoke, and yet something more, a faint sharpness, like the trace of scorched linen or the breath of an extinguished candle. Holmes moved slowly through the space, pausing not at the grand furnishings or paintings, but rather at the absences. The lack of books on the side table, the missing shawl from the armchair, the crooked angle of a carpet that suggested hasty passage. He said nothing for several minutes, simply absorbing. "It is not the presence of disorder that intrigues me," he said at length, "but its absence. This room has been scrubbed of intent." We ascended to the bedroom, where the bed remained neatly made. A wardrobe door stood ajar, revealing several garments still on their hangers, though one hook was conspicuously bare. "She meant to vanish without a trace," I murmured. Holmes turned to me, eyes narrowed. "Or she meant to leave only one." With that, he stooped to examine the scattered contents of a writing desk, where the first faint clue to her intent lay buried beneath a layer of dust and crumpled paper. It was I who first noticed the torn edge of parchment protruding from beneath the blotter on the desk. I handed it to Holmes, who unfolded it with care. The sheet bore the crest of the French diplomatic service, though the lower half had been violently torn away. What remained was in French, written in the bold, formal hand of a government scribe. Holmes read aloud, translating as he went. "To be transmitted by diplomatic pouch, relevant to the affair known only as l'ombre rouge. Her confession, if received in full, may destabilize." He stopped. The rest of the message was lost. I frowned. Confession? Of what nature? "That is precisely the question," Holmes replied, folding the paper once more. "The term l'ombre rouge, the red shadow, has surfaced in certain circles before. It referred, during the latter part of the Franco-Prussian War, to a covert series of misdirected communiques, many of them designed to compromise British neutrality. You suspect Lady Isidora was involved. I suspect only that she knew someone who was," he said. "But this telegram was neither sent nor destroyed, merely hidden. That suggests hesitation." He returned the fragment to its resting place with deliberate care. "The real confession, if it exists, may not be written on paper," Holmes said quietly. "But if we are to find it, we must look not where others left trails, but where they covered them." He rose suddenly, crossing the room to a delicate cabinet of rosewood. "And I believe our next whisper of truth may be heard in music, if one knows where to listen." The rosewood cabinet was unremarkable at first glance, its delicate inlay bearing the motifs of alpine wildflowers and vines. Holmes opened it with the lightest touch, revealing an old music box nestled within. Its lacquered surface shone faintly, and when he turned the key, it emitted a soft, tinkling melody. Something wistful and foreign, perhaps a Swiss lullaby. But Holmes's attention was not on the tune. He knelt, peering into the workings, then removed the base plate with a small penknife. Inside, nestled where the spring coils met the casing, was a cloth-wrapped bundle the size of a walnut. Holmes unwrapped it slowly. Within was a pistol, small, of continental make, a single-shot model with a pearl handle. Though antique in form, it was clearly serviceable. A faint oil sheen glistened on the barrel. "This has been cleaned recently," Holmes observed, "and loaded. Note the powder dust around the firing pin." I stared at it in disbelief. Then she expected danger. "Indeed," Holmes said, "or perhaps she had already met it." He studied the weapon further. "Not a murderess's tool, Watson. Too small, too intimate. This is a weapon of desperation. It speaks not of power, but of fear." I said nothing, for the room had grown oppressively quiet. The music had ceased, its final note suspended like a held breath. Then Holmes stood and returned the pistol to its hiding place. "She guarded herself with secrets," he murmured, "and secrets with steel." But it was not fear alone that had driven her to such measures. as we were soon to learn. For as I turned toward the cold hearth, I noticed something scorched and blackened within the grate. An object that had once been whole, but was now reduced to ash and memory. Within the grate lay a thin scatter of ashes and charred remains, oddly recent, as though the fire had been lit merely to consume and not to warm. Using the fire tongs, I withdrew a warped fragment of card, edges singed, the surface still bearing the faint impression of ink. "Photograph," I said, "or what remains of one." Holmes stepped beside me and took the remnant in hand, brushing away the flakes of soot. He held it to the light, rotating it with care, and then froze. "Look here," he said, pointing to the blurred image of a child's face. Just one cheek, an eye, and the edge of a collar remained intact. The features were indistinct, but not unrecognizable. "Good heavens," I breathed. "Is that—" "It bears more than a passing resemblance to Sir Reginald," Holmes murmured, "but younger, and too delicate for a son, perhaps. A brother. Or," he said quietly, "a child born beyond the knowledge of the public eye." There was something reverent in the way Holmes replaced the fragment on the mantel. "She burned it to hide it," I said. "No," he replied. "She burned it to erase it. A photograph is not merely an image. It is a claim, a memory rendered permanent. To destroy it is an act of finality." We stood in silence for a time. Holmes turned then, his eyes colder than I had seen them in weeks. "I do not yet know what Sir Reginald fears more, that his wife has fled, or that she might be found." And with that, we left the room behind, but not the weight it had placed upon our minds, for the shadows were growing longer, and the past had only just begun to speak. The final inquiry of the afternoon took us not inward, but outward, into the quiet terrace where the Martians resided. Holmes, ever reluctant to overlook even the most unassuming witness, knocked at several adjoining residences, speaking in low tones to housekeepers and footmen alike. It was from a certain Mrs. Withers, an elderly spinster with a fondness for her lace curtains, that we received the most compelling testimony. "Yes, sir," she said, squinting behind thick spectacles. "A man of strange aspect was loitering near the lamppost 2 nights past, pale as parchment and with a limp. He lingered some while, then vanished." Holmes's brow lifted slightly. "Did he speak to anyone?" "Not that I saw, but he looked up at the Marchand's windows more than once." She described the man's threadbare overcoat and limp gait in enough detail to inspire a modest search, and so it was that Holmes led us to a narrow alley several streets away, where a small soup kitchen operated. There, seated on an overturned crate with a crutch leaning beside him, we found our watcher. Holmes approached him gently. "You have been observing a house in Belgravia." The man blinked, startled. I sleep near there, sir. War injury, nothing more." After a few further questions, Holmes was satisfied. The man knew little, save that he found the Marchand windows warm to look upon. As we turned away, I could not help but feel the air of disappointment. "A red herring?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Harmless, but not pointless. Even the innocent may appear sinister in the right shadow." And with that, we left the alley, though not the growing sense that the true threat lay not outside Isadora's home, but within her past. Our next destination was the telegraph office on Victoria Street, where Holmes presented his card and requested access to recent outgoing messages from the Marchand residence. The clerk, a timid young fellow with ink-stained fingers, hesitated, but a quiet word from Holmes, together with the vague invocation of diplomatic urgency, sufficed. "Only one dispatch from that address in the last week," the clerk murmured, consulting his logbook. "Sent 3 nights ago, just past midnight." He produced a carbon copy. Holmes read aloud. "To Hotel du Lac, Geneva, for Monsieur Roland. Please confirm safe arrival. Further instruction to follow. The message cut off abruptly. Holmes frowned. What? Was that the signature? Only the letter, nothing more. Monsieur Roland, I repeated. A known figure. Not to me, Holmes replied, but his gaze remained fixed on the page. And yet, a hotel, a city, a name. These are not the choices of a woman fleeing at random. She reached out. To a lover, possibly, or an ally, or one whom she believed to be either, and discovered too late to be neither. He handed the slip back. Was it dispatched without delay? The clerk nodded. Yes, sir. Sent within 5 minutes. Holmes turned to me as we stepped back onto the rain-washed street. She was not hiding, he said. She was negotiating. Negotiating what? He said nothing at first. Then, in a voice colder than the wind, her silence, or his loyalty. And with that, he led the way onward, not speaking again until we were half a block from the telegraph office, where a deeper change had settled across his face. It was only as we reached the corner and paused to hail a cab that I truly noticed the alteration in Holmes's expression. The brisk clarity which had characterized his movements all morning was gone, replaced by a brooding stillness I had come to recognize only in our most complex investigations. Holmes, I said gently, what troubles you? He did not answer at once. His eyes followed a passing carriage, though I doubt he saw it. She has placed her trust in someone dangerous, he said finally. Whether willingly or under compulsion, I do not yet know. But what began as a case of disappearance, Watson, now smells of treachery, perhaps even treason. I was startled. Treason? He nodded. This Roland is not a name, but a cipher. And the message, it was not sent in fear, but in finality. She meant it to reach someone who already knew the stakes. Then she is complicit. She is entangled, he said. There is a difference, and in such webs, guilt and innocence often bleed together. We rode in silence then, bound for Baker Street. But I knew from the glint in Holmes's eye that our journey would not end in London. The passage to Geneva was swift and uneventful, save for the ceaseless hum of my own mind as I attempted to piece together the fragments we had thus far uncovered. Holmes, as ever, travelled in a silence that was far from idle. By the time we reached the Gare Cornavin, his bearing had changed entirely, not by posture or tone, but by subtle alterations of dress and demeanour. I am Mr. Absalom Vane, he informed the customs official with effortless conviction, a London antiquarian in search of Byzantine manuscripts. I, of course, was rebranded as his loyal assistant, a role I found strangely fitting. Our lodgings were secured in a modest guest house with a view of the Rhone, and it was there, as we unpacked our limited effects, that Holmes gave me my instructions. You are to speak sparingly, Watson. Our work here will draw the gaze of men who look not with eyes, but with memory. Familiarity is danger. Anonymity, our shield. He said it not with fear, but with quiet resolve. I recall walking beside him later that evening, our boots crunching lightly upon the frost-laced pavements, the Alps looming pale in the distance. It was not the beauty of Geneva that held my attention, but the careful precision with which Holmes moved through it, reading the city not as a visitor, but as a hunter, alert to every silence between the notes. And thus began our descent beneath the tranquil mask of Switzerland into shadows more enduring than snow. It was the following morning, over a modest breakfast of boiled eggs and dark bread, that Holmes, with the window's weak winter light casting a pallor across his features, at last confided in me. There is more at stake here, Watson, than a vanished woman or a jealous husband. I am increasingly persuaded that we are brushing the edge of something older, colder, something born in the dying fires of the Franco-Prussian War. He leaned back, eyes narrowed, You recall, no doubt, the covert communications scandal that nearly drew Britain into open conflict. A web of misinformation, false diplomatic letters, and strategic manipulations. It was never publicly named, but within certain circles it was referred to as the Garrick Protocol. I nodded faintly, remembering whispers of it from the periphery of my own medical service. It was never resolved, Holmes continued. Documents vanished. Witnesses changed allegiance or disappeared. And now, I believe, one of those ghosts has stirred again, through Isadora Marchand. But to what end? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. To preserve, or to expose, he said. We must determine which. He folded his napkin with precision and rose. And to do that, we must go where footprints are faint, but still warm. The Hotel du Lac, perched with studied grace along the lakefront, welcomed us as it had countless others, without question, but not without notice. Holmes, in his guise as Mr. Vane, requested a room overlooking the east wing, and by evening we had begun our inquiries in earnest. It was through the simple device of conversation with a chambermaid, facilitated by Holmes's feigned interest in the region's woodwork, that we confirmed what we had suspected. Yes, monsieur, the girl had said. A Madame Duval arrived 4 days ago, alone, but with an air of being watched. She dines in her room. She speaks little, sleeps less. Duval, Holmes repeated later, once we had withdrawn. An obvious choice. The name bears no history, no national association, blank yet polite. What of visitors? Only one of note. A man claiming to be her cousin. Dark-haired, always with gloves. He visits at nightfall and stays no longer than an hour. Does he sign in? Rarely, but once he did. Under the name Roland. The name struck like a thread drawn taut across our investigation, humming now with certainty. Holmes steepled his fingers. She is not hiding from danger. She is trying to manage it. But the question remains, does Roland come bearing protection or poison? It was a question to which we would soon draw closer, for Holmes had already sent a discreet inquiry to a contact in Lausanne, known for remembering men others tried to forget. It was 2 days later, as the snows began to settle more thickly upon the eaves, that Holmes returned from the café, across from the Hôtel de Police, with the trace of triumph beneath his reserved demeanour. Roland Deschamps, he said as he shut the door behind him. Once a pamphleteer, later a firebrand. He made his name during the upheavals in Lausanne, inciting factory strikes and preaching insurrection under the banner of social purity. A revolutionary. Once, but no longer. After his expulsion from the student leagues, he vanished for some years. He re-emerged briefly during the war as a courier between embassies. Then again, silence. And now he hides behind an alias and visits a woman with secrets worth burning for. I could not suppress a shiver. Isadora knew him during his radical days. Unlikely, but she may have encountered him in Paris under different pretenses. It is not uncommon for such men to shift masks, Watson. Revolution becomes reform. Reform becomes diplomacy, but the nature beneath seldom changes. Holmes walked to the window and gazed out upon the glistening lake. There is a thread, he said softly, that binds war and love and treachery together, and it is often frayed where loyalty was once tied. That night, we kept watch from the hotel's reading room, overlooking the side entrance. And there, as the hour neared 10, Roland Deschamps passed by once more, his gloved hand tucked into his coat, his pace deliberate. Holmes leaned forward. The time for watching is done. Now we must follow. The snow had ceased, but the fog had risen, thick and clinging, so that the lamps lining the quay appeared as golden orbs adrift in smoke. We followed Deschamps at a discreet distance, Holmes slipping through shadow, as though it bent willingly to accommodate him. Our path led us away from the warmth of the city centre, down to the lower quay near the boat warehouses. There, beneath a stone arch partially veiled in ivy, Deschamps paused. He struck a match, lit a cigarette, and waited. Moments later, another figure emerged from the mist. He was shorter, stockier, and unmistakably English. Though his hat was drawn low, I caught the glint of a Foreign Office pin at his lapel. They spoke briefly. Voices hushed, tones clipped. Holmes motioned for me to remain still and crept closer. When he returned, his eyes held the glint of fire caught on ice. "Our suspicions are confirmed," he whispered. "The man is Carstairs, an attaché under Sir Reginald, reassigned last year under questionable circumstances, and he has just handed Deschamps a sealed envelope." "For what purpose?" "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must uncover." Deschamps and Carstairs parted without shaking hands. Holmes and I waited in the fog until the last footstep vanished, and only then did he speak again. "This is no longer a matter of concealment," he said gravely. "This is a trade, secrets for silence, and if we are not swift, the cost will be another life." The summons arrived mid-morning, its bearer a breathless constable from the gendarmerie, who had been instructed, by whom he did not know, to find a Mr. Absalom Vane at our guest house near the Jardin Anglais. Holmes took the note with his usual economy of gesture. I noted only a flicker in his expression before he turned to me. "Come, Watson," he said, "the lake has yielded a secret." We followed the officer by carriage to a secluded inlet not far from the Pont de la Coulouvrenière. There, beneath a canopy of bare branches and whispering fog, lay the body. Roland Deschamps was sprawled on his back, one arm flung outward towards the icy shallows. A single bullet had entered cleanly through the chest, no sign of a struggle, no witnesses. His dark coat, though damp, bore no tear beyond that fatal point. Holmes knelt beside the corpse, his hand brushing aside a lock of damp hair with startling tenderness. "A swift end," he murmured, "almost merciful." "But not accidental?" I asked. "No," he said, "nor impulsive. This was carried out with knowledge and precision." He examined the hands, one clenched, the other half curled. His fingers hesitated at the coat's lining. He came to meet someone, not to flee. He expected to speak, not to die. I stepped back, the solemnity of the moment pressing against my ribs like a held breath. And in that silence, I saw Holmes tilt his head slightly. "There's something more here, Watson. Something written in thread." With an expression of curious resolve, Holmes produced a small penknife from his inner pocket and carefully slit the inner lining of Deschamps' coat. A rustle of silk, a gentle tug, and then a folded slip of aged, ochre-toned paper emerged from the hidden seam. He unfolded it slowly. The markings upon it were sparse but striking, rows of inked triangles and half-circles interspersed with Roman letters and the occasional German word. Holmes scrutinized the sheet in silence. "Encrypted," he muttered, but crudely, as if done in haste. He tapped one finger against a partial phrase scrawled along the lower margin. "Durch diese hohle Gasse muss kommen." He read aloud. I recognized the line at once. "Through this narrow passage he must pass. Goethe's Wilhelm Tell." Holmes nodded. An apt metaphor. The cipher is the gate, the passage is information, and someone feared what lay beyond. What does it signify? That Deschamps had not merely intended to expose Carstairs, but to do so with documentation, perhaps names, perhaps operational details. This cipher is incomplete, but if cracked, it could lay bare more than one reputation. He refolded the paper and slipped it into his breast pocket. This was not blackmail, Watson. It was a final act of loyalty, perhaps to Isadora, or to truth itself. We stood again as the constables approached. Holmes gave a brief nod, then turned from the corpse as one might turn from a monument, measured but mournful. And just then, a new whisper reached us, borne by hurried footsteps. Isidora had vanished. The concierge of the Hôtel du Lac was a round-shouldered man with a face like baked dough, soft and furrowed with concern. "She left before dawn, monsieur," he said, wringing his hands. "No notice. No carriage ordered." Her key returned at the desk in silence. Holmes examined the logbook. The final entry bore her false name, Madame Duval, and the simple notation, Départ à 5 heures. "Anything left behind?" "Only this," the man replied, producing a lady's hat, modest, dark blue, trimmed with jet beading. It was unmistakably hers, for I had glimpsed it on her luggage upon our arrival. "She left no message?" I asked. The concierge shook his head. "Nothing, monsieur. It is as though she vanished into the snow." Holmes turned the hat slowly in his hands, examining the ribbon. "She feared discovery," he murmured, "or worse, she feared being believed too late." As we stepped into the foyer, Holmes paused beside the lift and looked out through the frosted windows. "She will not have gone far, Watson," he said, "not without learning what happened by the lake." And I knew then, with the certainty born of experience, that we were nearing the hour when truths must choose between light and shadow. That evening, by the low fire of our temporary lodgings, Holmes sat motionless for nearly an hour, his gaze fixed upon the ciphered slip retrieved from Deschamps' coat. Then, with sudden clarity, he spoke. "She was in Paris, you know, during the worst of it." "The siege?" "Yes, and what followed. At the time I believed her merely a consular wife, a satellite to Sir Reginald's dull orbit. But I now suspect she worked for the Crown herself." I stared. "An agent." "In a manner. There was a propaganda unit stationed unofficially under the embassy's shadow. Women fluent in multiple tongues, cultured enough to blend in among salons, yet loyal to Britain's aims. They wrote, whispered, influenced. Their weapons were not bullets, but narrative." He tapped the paper. "Deschamps knew. Perhaps he was once one of their tools, or their targets. Perhaps he discovered the hand behind the pen." "And tried to expose it?" Holmes nodded gravely. "Not out of vengeance, I think, but conviction. He feared Isidora had betrayed the ideals she once served." I sat in silence, stunned by the breadth of implication. Holmes added, "If she burned the photograph to erase a child, she sent the glove to preserve a truth. A confession or a warning? And so the ghost of wartime Paris, the glamour and the subterfuge, returned to haunt Geneva, bearing with it the weight of vanished loyalties and unfinished crimes. It was as we returned from the gendarmerie station, our breath visible in the crisp night air, that I spotted it. "Holmes, look!" Half submerged at the lake's edge, where the snow met the stones, a dark shape clung to the shore like a relic of the drowned. I knelt and retrieved it with a gloved hand. It was another glove, identical in make to the one Holmes had received in London, but drenched, heavy with lake water. The embroidery along the cuff was slightly frayed, yet unmistakable. Holmes took it, his eyes narrowing. "Roland clutched this. How can you be certain?" "Because the thread is pulled outward from the fingers. He held it, perhaps moments before his death, perhaps in plea, perhaps in revelation. He turned it over once more. This is no mere token, Watson. It is a final gesture. She was here." "You believe he met her?" "I believe she arrived too late, or someone else arrived too early." Holmes pocketed the glove. "There is a pattern here, Watson, but the hands do not yet align." And so, beneath the veil of fog, we returned to our quarters, bearing now 2 gloves, 1 cipher, and the echo of a shot not yet explained. That night, As Holmes lit his pipe in contemplative silence, I posed the question that had pressed upon me since the lakeside discovery. Do you believe she killed him? He exhaled a curl of smoke. Number. She fled, yes, but not in guilt, in fear, not for herself, but for what Roland might reveal without understanding. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. If she once acted as a servant of British interests, then she now protects them still, not by silence but by shielding them from those who would exploit fragments of truth into weapons. And the killer? Someone with more to lose than either of them. Someone who preferred Roland dead rather than explained. He tapped ash into the tray. This is not a tale of betrayal, Watson. It is a tragedy of loyalty, misread, misused, and perhaps misremembered. And so we slept that night uneasily, knowing the storm had yet to break. The following morning was grey and windless, the city cloaked in a pall of frozen stillness that seemed to hush even the lake. Holmes had not slept. He had spent the long hours poring over the ciphered message from Roland's coat, assisted only by a German lexicon and a battered copy of Goethe's Wilhelm Tell. Observe, Watson, he said quietly, when I rose and joined him. The quotation is not ornamental. It is the key. He pointed to the scrawl beneath the encoded line. Durch diese hohle Gasse muss kommen. The phrase refers to Gessler's fatal ambush, a trap sprung in a narrow pass. Now note these symbols here. Triangle, circle, triangle again. A simple substitution cipher. With patient articulation, he deciphered the line. He is still within the Foreign Office, still feeding both sides. Geneva was not his last gate. He? I asked. Holmes nodded. The man Deschamps sought to expose. The traitor Isidora once obeyed under duress. A collaborator, protected during the war, concealed after it. He rose and moved to the window. He knew too much and said too little. Deschamps gave his life to send this message, not for vengeance, but to illuminate a shadow that persisted long after the war's smoke had cleared. Holmes's voice took on that rare solemnity I had learned to recognize. And now, Watson, we must give that shadow a name, for it is not enough to know he walks among us. We must see where he walks next. We took our midday meal in silence, save for the occasional scratch of Holmes' pencil across a note card. Then, as the hour struck 2, he set his utensils aside and leaned toward me. Do you recall the name Edmund Carstairs? I searched my memory. A diplomatic clerk, was he not? Served under Sir Reginald in Paris. Indeed, promoted quietly, removed even more quietly. His dismissal coincided with a leaked communiqué that nearly endangered the Prussian ceasefire. No charges were brought. Holmes retrieved a dossier from his case. Carstairs was clever enough to make himself useful to both friend and foe. He operated beneath the surface, managing private briefings, coded transmissions, and, I suspect, the recruitment of unwilling agents. You mean Isidora? She was young, fluent, married to a man of rank, the perfect vessel, and Carstairs, the perfect poison. My stomach turned. Holmes continued. Deschamps must have uncovered the connection between Carstairs and the disinformation campaign. Roland likely confronted Isidora, or sought to use her to force Carstairs' hand. And Carstairs silenced him. Holmes's eyes were steely. There is only one way to confirm it. He pushed back his chair. We must offer Carstairs the very bait he killed to keep hidden. That evening, under Holmes's strict instruction, Sir Reginald penned a letter in his own hand, one trembling slightly despite the man's military bearing. It was addressed to Mr. Edmund Carstairs, and its contents, crafted with Holmes's precision, hinted at a damning document in Reginald's possession, one allegedly smuggled to him via an intermediary from Roland Deschamps. The letter offered a meeting. The matter is best settled in person. Discretion is paramount. Come to the lakeside boathouse at midnight. I will be alone." Holmes ensured the handwriting bore the subtle inconsistencies that would mask any coached phrasing, and Reginald, though visibly shaken, signed his name with the weary resignation of one who saw no alternative. "Do you believe he'll come?" I asked, once the letter had been dispatched. "Without question," Holmes replied. "Men like Carstairs survive by striking first. A delayed confrontation is a danger." The boathouse was a small structure set against the embankment, disused in winter. Holmes selected it for its narrow approach and limited visibility, just like Gessler's Pass in the cipher. At 10 o'clock, Holmes and I took our places in the thicket beyond the boathouse, hidden by frost-draped branches. Sir Reginald waited inside with a flask and a trembling brow. And so we watched the lake grow still beneath the stars, waiting for a man whose treachery had crossed continents and was now coming home to answer for it. The lake's edge shimmered faintly in the moonlight, disturbed only by the occasional cry of a night-bird. At midnight, a figure appeared, alone, cautious, and hunched against the cold. Edmund Carstairs moved like a man who feared mirrors, every motion calculated, every glance a suspicion. He paused at the boathouse door. Then, with a final glance behind, he entered. Through a crack in the wood, Holmes and I could just make out the outline of Sir Reginald seated beside a lantern, a folded sheet of paper in his hand. Carstairs approached, his posture stiff with false civility. "I came because you insisted," he began. "You came because you fear what's written here," Reginald replied. His voice, to his credit, was steady. "I've no idea." But Carstairs reached for his coat pocket, too swiftly for innocence. In that moment, Holmes surged forward. The door burst inward, and he struck Carstairs' arm with his cane, sending the pistol clattering to the floor. "Enough," Holmes said, his voice like tempered steel. Carstairs backed against the wall, pale and panting. "You—" "Indeed," Holmes said, "and you have walked directly into your own ambush." Reginald sank into his chair with a long breath. "Stay seated, both of you," Holmes commanded. "This night does not end in bloodshed, only in revelation." The silence that followed was not of peace, but of unmasking. Under Holmes's stern gaze and the lantern's pallid glow, Edmund Carstairs seemed to shrink, no longer the cold architect of secrets, but a man corroded by the very lies he once commanded. "You knew she was vulnerable," Holmes said evenly. "You made her useful, then disposable." Carstairs looked away. "She was not forced." "She was manipulated," Holmes corrected. "You knew she loved her country. You wrapped betrayal in patriotism." Carstairs gave a hollow laugh. "And yet, she stayed silent until Roland appeared with his righteous talk." "Did he threaten you?" "He offered to make noise, but I knew better. Noise becomes fire. Fire consumes all." "And so you extinguished it," Holmes said. "A single bullet." "And then what? Blame Isadora." "She arrived too late," Carstairs whispered. "She saw what she was not meant to see. And so you vanished, leaving just enough to suggest her guilt." He said nothing. Holmes folded his arms. "You will return to London. You will answer before the Foreign Office, and before the truth." "I'll be buried," Carstairs muttered. "No," Holmes said. "You'll be unburied. That is what you fear most." He turned to Reginald. "Your wife is not a traitor. She is a survivor. The harm was never hers, but yours, for letting it fester." The night wind stirred the lake behind us. A storm had passed, but the wreckage still smouldered. The morning after Carstairs' capture, Holmes slipped from our lodgings without a word. I knew better than to follow uninvited. When he returned, hours later, his coat was dusted with frost, and his manner unusually subdued. "She was hiding less than a mile away," he said, unbuttoning his cuffs with mechanical calm. A villa, shuttered and unassuming. The kind of place one chooses when one no longer wishes to be found. You saw her. I did. She was as I remembered, proud even in ruin, and ruinously proud. He sank into his chair, fingers steepled. She believed herself alone, Watson, that neither country nor husband nor conscience had room left for her. But you persuaded her. I reminded her that silence, too, has a cost, and that the dead deserve more than our retreat. A knock came at the door. It was the hotel valet, announcing the arrival of Madame Marchand. Holmes stood. Come, Watson. The time for concealment has passed. Truth does not walk unaccompanied. It must be invited in. And so we descended to the quiet parlour, where shadows long carried began, at last, to lift. The salon Holmes had secured was modest, panelled in walnut, warmed by a coal fire, and possessing that rare stillness which seems to press honesty from reluctant lips. Sir Reginald stood near the hearth, hands behind his back, jaw clenched with soldierly tension. Carstairs sat at a small table, pale but composed, his gaze fixed on the snow drifting outside the leaded panes. Isadora entered like a spectre, wrapped in charcoal grey, her veil lowered, her posture stiffened by a dignity born not of pride, but of survival. Holmes gestured to a seat between them. We're not here to debate consequences, he said quietly. Only facts. She removed her gloves with careful slowness. And what value do facts hold when reputations are already shaped? Holmes met her gaze. Truth does not preserve names, madame. It redeems them. A silence followed. Then Isadora looked to her husband, not with bitterness, but with a gaze stripped of pretense. You wish to know why I ran, she said. He gave a single nod. She inhaled, and for the first time in years, I believe, Isadora Marchand began to speak, not to justify, but to release. The truth, like mist from a sealed room, began to rise. I was 23 when Carstairs approached me, she began. Her voice was even, almost clinical, as though reciting the facts of someone else's misfortune. A diplomat's wife, fluent in 4 tongues, invisible in rooms filled with noise. Carstairs shifted, but said nothing. They told me I was serving my country, that words could do what bullets could not. I was to pass notes at receptions, correct speeches, rewrite telegrams, nothing illegal, only influential. She turned slightly, her profile lit by the fire's flicker. And then came the pressure. Requests became commands, corrections became lies. And when I hesitated, Carstairs reminded me of my husband's career, of my family in Kent, of what scandal could do to a woman alone. Her hands trembled as she folded them. When the war ended, I asked to leave it all behind. Carstairs refused. He said I was too valuable. Her voice cracked then, but she pressed on. Roland found me last month. He had pieced it together. He believed I was complicit. I wasn't. I never wanted... She fell silent. Sir Reginald stepped forward, but it was Holmes who raised his hand gently. You lived in the shadow of service, he said. But even shadows break when truth is spoken. She looked at him, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, the fragile relief of being seen. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the glove, the second one, pulled from Roland's lifeless grasp at the lake's edge. He laid it gently on the table, the damp leather now stiffened with age and cold. Madame, do you recognize this? Isadora nodded slowly. It is mine. And yet, Holmes continued, turning the cuff outward, here, see this faint depression just beside the stitching? A subtle indentation, as though made by pressure. Carstairs's gaze sharpened. This, Holmes said, is the impression of a man's thumb. Not pressed in carelessly, but held, clutched. He turned toward Carstairs. Roland was not holding the glove as a token. He was holding a hand. Your hand. Carstairs opened his mouth, but no words came. He trusted you, Holmes continued, or at least believed he might be heard, but what he received was a bullet. He placed the glove beside Isadora's other, forming a quiet pair. Together, they seemed less like evidence and more like memorial. Holmes looked between them. Guilt cannot be proven by absence alone, but it can sometimes be read in the pressure one exerts on people, on history, on a cuff stitched by an innocent woman. The silence in that room was like none I had known. Carstairs's breath grew shallow, his composure, ever a mask, fractured under the weight of logic and memory. I didn't mean for it to go so far, he muttered. He wouldn't stop. He wanted to drag it all into the light. Everything. You feared the light, Holmes replied. So you reached, not to reason, but to erase. Isadora closed her eyes. Holmes gave a single nod to the constable waiting outside, who entered and took Carstairs gently by the arm. Sir Reginald remained motionless as Carstairs was led away. Then at last, he turned to his wife, not with accusation, but with the aching look of a man glimpsing the wreckage of something once whole. "Can we begin again?" he asked. Isadora did not reply, but she did not walk away, and in that silence I heard the sound of something breaking, not apart, but open. Our journey back to London was enveloped in a hush I dared not disturb. Holmes reclined with his head against the cushioned frame of the railway compartment, eyes closed not in slumber, but in some deeper meditation. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels seemed to echo the weight of the revelations behind us. Though I was bursting with questions, I sensed that his silence was not born of fatigue, but of some inward reckoning. The events in Geneva, Isadora's testimony, Carstairs' unmasking, and the tragic demise of Roland Deschamps had left an unusual gravity upon my friend. We arrived at Victoria Station just past dusk. A low fog, tinged yellow by the gas lamps, clung to the cobbles like a slow-moving tide. Baker Street, when we reached it, was cloaked in familiar gloom, and Mrs. Hudson had already laid a fire in the grate. Holmes removed his overcoat with deliberate slowness, hung his hat, and motioned me wordlessly to the armchair opposite him. "My dear Watson," he said at last, "shall we place the final pieces of this matter upon the board?" And so, as the coals hissed behind us, he began. Holmes reached for his pipe, struck a match, and with that familiar curl of smoke, allowed the case to take shape anew. "It began," he said, "with a single glove, an item both delicate and damning. But it was not merely the object itself, Watson. It was the context in which it arrived. Anonymous delivery, residual gunpowder, the scent of lake air. Together, they spoke of urgency, flight, and a final cry for help." He rose and paced before the hearth, each step measured. From the drawing room in London to the lakeside in Geneva, every fragment, each telegram, burnt photograph, and whispered name formed part of a greater mosaic. Isadora was not fleeing justice, but seeking sanctuary from it. Roland was no villain, but a courier of uncomfortable truths. And Carstairs— Holmes paused. He was the thread that stitched manipulation across borders and years. I leaned forward, struck anew by the elegance of the architecture Holmes had discerned from apparent chaos. Everything, Watson, every symbol, scent, and silence had its appointed place. He turned to me then. "It is not the quantity of clues that guides a detective's hand," he said, "but the alignment of their shadows." He walked to the bureau and opened the top drawer, retrieving both gloves. They were worn now from handling, one stained by water, the other still bearing the faintest trace of cordite. "These," Holmes said softly, "were not evidence in the traditional sense. They were a message, a cipher of the heart." He laid them side by side on the desk. Isidora sent the first to me, not in hope that I might arrest a murderer, but that I might read what others would overlook: the scent of lake air, Geneva, the gunpowder, danger, the absence of a note, a woman forced to speak through the only means left to her. He paused. She did not trust the police. She could not confide in her husband, but she remembered, perhaps from some long-ago encounter or whispered reputation, that I had once brought clarity to things made murky by power. I felt, then, a rare swelling of admiration, not merely for Holmes's intellect, but for the quiet moral compass that drove him. The gloves, he said finally, were not left to incriminate. They were entrusted, and in that distinction lay the very soul of the case. Roland Deschamps, Holmes began, was, in some respects, a mirror held to our own institutions, a man of conviction, made dangerous by idealism. He resumed his seat, fingers steepled. He believed Isidora complicit in what he termed the silencing of truth. In reality, she was its first casualty. When he arrived in Geneva, he did so with the intention of exposing Carstairs. He believed that shining light on the past would free all its prisoners. But he misjudged the depth of the quicksand, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Precisely. He reached for justice, but touched a nerve. Carstairs, cornered by the risk of exposure, chose expediency. A quiet bullet, a staged impression of Isidora's presence, and a body posed with a glove intended to damn. Holmes's gaze fell to the hearth. It is the peril of truth, Watson. It does not always arrive in heroic garb. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, crushed underfoot before it may speak. He inhaled deeply. Roland died not for what he did, but for what he threatened to undo. And yet, by that death, he drew the poison from the wound, unwittingly, but decisively. Holmes stood and approached the mantelpiece, where he had placed the scrap of paper bearing the cipher, Roland's final act of defiance. The passage from Goethe, he said, tapping the edge, was no mere flourish, it was the key. He quoted it softly. In der Beschränkung zeigt sich erst der Meister. In limitation, the master reveals himself, I translated. Indeed, Holmes affirmed. Roland lacked resources. He relied on constraint, a cipher sewn into his coat, a literary phrase known only to those who shared his intellectual bent. It was not meant for the world, Watson. It was meant for me. He turned back to the gloves. The lake air told me Geneva. The gunpowder hinted at conflict, perhaps espionage. But it was the Goethe passage that illuminated Carstairs' name. The letters corresponded to a ciphered telegram we found at Isidora's residence, cross-referenced with known British operatives in Paris, a buried truth, exhumed by deduction. He exhaled quietly. In the end, there were no ghosts, only choices, weighted by fear and duty. The clock struck the hour. Holmes smiled faintly. And so, Watson, with all threads tied, we wait for the next glove, the next whisper, the next shadow. It was late upon a Wednesday evening, the fog lying thick as unshaken cream over Baker Street, when Holmes and I sat once more in our familiar chairs. The fire had burned low, casting thin lines of gold upon the carpet, and the ticking of the mantelpiece clock was the only sound to accompany our thoughts. Outside, the world moved in muffled tones, as though reluctant to speak. For my part, I found no comfort in our return. The events in Geneva lingered upon the mind like smoke in one's coat, impossible to shake off entirely. The snow-laden stillness of the lakeside, the broken expression upon Isidora's face, and the weary finality with which Holmes closed the ciphered document, all these played across the theatre of my recollection with disquieting clarity. Holmes had said little since our arrival. He sat, legs crossed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes trained on the fire. The silhouette he cast upon the wall behind him, slender, unmoving, seemed less man than monument. I, meanwhile, could not help but ponder the cost that truth exacts from those who pursue it, and more still from those who bear it. Cases such as these leave no triumph in their wake, only ashes, and unanswered questions. Yet it was in that very silence, that lack of fanfare, where Holmes seemed most at peace. In the solitude of that dusky room, I found myself turning over the matter, not with the mind of a physician or chronicler, but with the soul of a man who had once served under oath. What struck me was not the violence, nor even the deception, but the unseen weight borne by those entangled in a web spun by nations. Isidora Marchand, for all the shadows that encircled her, had carried that burden with a strange nobility, used, discarded, and at last hunted, not by common criminals, but by men in starched collars and whispered corridors. She had chosen not retribution, but revelation, and in doing so, she had risked the little peace that remained to her. Was it duty that drove her, or the need for some final absolution? The answer eluded me. Holmes, I suspected, had come to his own conclusions long before we boarded the train for Geneva. He had known, or perhaps merely intuited, that this was not a case of villainy, but of consequence. One in which even the innocent wore masks, and guilt was a matter of perspective. I could not help but think of the child in the photograph, the one nearly lost to fire. Who was he, and what future lay ahead for him in a world such as ours? These thoughts returned unbidden, like waves against the shore of memory. In espionage, justice is seldom blind. It sees only what it is permitted. And so I sat, wondering not only about what had been lost, but about what had never been allowed to exist. At length, Holmes stirred. "There is a cruelty, Watson," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, "that does not lie in murder, nor even in betrayal, but in the architecture that makes both necessary." He did not look at me as he spoke, but rather into the dancing heart of the flames. The glow etched his profile into a study of restraint, sharp, calm, and yet touched by something mournful. "It is not the blade," he continued, "but the shadow behind it that draws blood in silence, and that shadow is often one's own country." I was startled by the candour of his words. Rarely did Holmes permit himself such statements. Rarer still did he attach them to so abstract a realm as patriotism. "There are times," he said, "when the pursuit of national interest devours the individual whole, leaves no tombstone nor honour, only silence. Deschamps died not as an enemy, but as a threat to narrative. And Isidora, she survived not by virtue of innocence, but by the cruelty of omission." I leaned forward. "And you believe such things inevitable?" He smiled faintly. "I believe, he said, "that when men dress necessity in the robes of honour, they teach themselves to forget the body buried beneath." He turned to me then, eyes steady. "That is why we must remember, Watson, even if the world does not ask it of us." I nodded, the weight of the case settling like snowfall upon my shoulders. In that moment, Holmes and I were no longer merely observer and analyst, but custodians of a truth no ledger would record. I do not know what prompted the question, perhaps the lateness of the hour, or the quiet conviction in Holmes's last words, but I found myself asking what had troubled me since we left Geneva. Was justice served, Holmes? He did not answer at once. Instead, he took up his violin, turned it slowly in his hands, and set it gently aside before speaking. "There are cases, Watson, where justice is a blade, sharp, visible, and swift. Others where it is a thread, nearly invisible, running beneath the fabric, never noticed until it frays." "And this case?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes distant. "This was neither," he said. "It was a storm muffled by snow, a reckoning that arrived too late to punish and too early to pardon. Justice? Perhaps not. But truth at least, had its moment in the sun. He rose then and poured himself a measure of brandy, offering one to me in turn. I accepted. "Do you suppose she will ever be free of it?" I asked, meaning Isadora. Holmes regarded the window. "One is never free, Watson. One only learns to breathe through the smoke." There was no moral tidy enough for publication, no victory fit for proclamation, only the quiet knowledge that one woman had dared to place her hope in reason, and that Holmes had answered, not as a soldier, nor as a judge, but as a man still willing to listen. We had begun to drift into that companionable silence that often marked the end of Holmes's more taxing adventures, when a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a yellow envelope upon a silver tray. "A telegram, Mr. Holmes, just arrived." He thanked her absently, broke the seal with a flick of his long fingers, and read the message with that impassive expression I had long since learned to regard with suspicion. "Well?" I asked, setting down my glass. He folded the paper neatly, as though it contained nothing more than the week's milk account. "Another woman," he said. "Another mystery." He did not elaborate. Instead, he rose and retrieved his coat from the stand. "This one," he added, slipping on his gloves, "will not end in Geneva. It begins, rather curiously, in Vienna." I raised an eyebrow. "And what of the hour?" "There are trains, Watson," he said, "for men who prefer to travel in shadow, and cases that wait for no dawn." With that, he strode towards the door, the telegram tucked within his breast pocket. I followed, as I always did. Outside, the fog still clung to the lamplight, like gauze upon a wound. And somewhere in the unseen reaches of Europe, another story was beginning, its threads unknown, its truth yet veiled. But Holmes was already at the threshold, and I, with coat drawn close and pen ready, followed him once more into the grey. As the lamplight flickered across the quiet parlour of Baker Street, Holmes reached for his pipe with the unhurried elegance that followed the solving of a grave affair. "Watson," he murmured, "it is a peculiar thing. How silence can weigh heavier than guilt, and how the truth, once buried beneath the flags of nations, becomes a burden few are permitted to lift." I said nothing, watching the smoke coil upward like the ghosts we'd left behind in Geneva. "She did not flee justice," Holmes added softly. "She fled the shadow of what justice becomes when men like Carstairs shape its form." What do you think? Was Isadora truly free at the end, or had her loyalty simply chained her to a different kind of prison? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do subscribe for more of Holmes's most delicate and dangerous cases, and if this mystery left you pondering, be sure to share it with a fellow detective-minded friend.